Private property. It's a concept we deal with every single day, right? But the simple idea of saying, this is mine, well, it has one of the most incredible, surprising stories in all of human history. So let's get into it. Okay, to really get this, we have to go way, way back. I'm talking long before any laws, any courts, any lawyers, ownership. It was just a basic instinct. Picture a bird fiercely defending its nest, or a wolf protecting its territory. That gut feeling, that primal urge to claim something and say, stay away, that's where this whole story really kicks off. And now let's jump forward thousands of years. We're literally making legal claims to minerals on asteroids millions of miles away in space. So the big question is, how in the world did we get from a simple bird's nest to claiming a rock floating in the cosmos? That journey, that's the story of the word mine. We're going to trace how that raw instinct got built up into this massive pillar of our modern world. It shapes everything, our laws, our economy, you name it. And as we'll see, it's now being tested in ways that people just a few decades ago would have thought was pure science fiction. All right, so to really understand this whole property thing, we need to strip away all the legal jargon for a second. We're going back to a time before kings, before fancy documents. It all started with something super simple, the need to survive. And what's so wild is that there's some really cool science behind this. Evolutionary biologists have figured out that respecting someone else's claim, it isn't about being polite. Nope, it's actually a winning survival strategy. Think about it. For an animal, fighting an established owner is dangerous. It wastes precious energy. It was almost always a smarter bet to just find another resource that wasn't already taken. So this whole idea of first dibs actually evolved as a way to avoid a lot of unnecessary, costly fights. So you can see here, this was a long road from pure instinct to a formal institution. For thousands of years, it was dead simple. You owned what you could physically defend. That's it. Then came the agricultural revolution, and suddenly land became the most important thing, tying ownership to a specific spot on the map. But even then, for centuries, under the whole feudal system, owning property was basically a privilege handed down from a king to his buddies. It wasn't until the Enlightenment that this, truly radical idea popped up, that property could be a natural right for everybody. And that huge shift, from just a gut feeling to a powerful idea, was driven by some of the biggest thinkers in history. They're the ones who took that primal, this is mine feeling and built a whole moral and logical framework around it. And this right here, this quote from the philosopher John Locke, you could argue this is ground zero for our entire modern concept of private property. His big idea was this: before you can own anything out there in the world, you have to first own yourself, your own body. Now, in an age of kings and serfs, that was an absolutely mind-blowing, revolutionary thought. It took the power away from the king and gave it to the individual. And from that one idea, Locke builds this really elegant, simple logic. It just flows perfectly. Step 1, you own your body. Okay, makes sense. Step 2, that means you also own the labor of your body, your actions. Right. So step 3, when you take that labor and mix it with something that nobody owns, say picking an apple from a tree in the wild, you've literally mixed a part of yourself into that apple. And that action is what pulls it out of the shared commons and makes it yours. So if you think about it, Locke gave us the moral backbone for private property, but it was the economist Adam Smith who came along and gave it the economic engine. See, Smith wasn't as focused on natural justice. He was all about practical results. He said, look, when people know their property is safe and secure, they have a huge incentive to work harder, to innovate, to invest for the future. And that personal drive, he argued, creates this wave of prosperity that ends up benefiting everyone in society. So you've got these two pillars, Locke's moral right and Smith's economic benefit. And together, they became the foundation of modern property law. Okay, but this whole celebration of private ownership slams right into a massive problem. What about the stuff we all share? The oceans, the air we breathe, fish in the sea. If everyone owns something, does that mean no one actually has a reason to take care of it? This is what's famously known as the tragedy of the commons. Here's the classic example. Imagine a big, open pasture that all the local herders can use. For any single herder, the logic is super simple. Hey, if I just add one more cow, I get all the profit from that cow. But the downside, the field getting a little more overgrazed, that cost is shared by everybody. The problem is, when every single herder makes that same perfectly logical choice for themselves, the pasture inevitably gets destroyed, and then everybody loses. It's this crazy paradox where everyone acting in their own best interest leads to a total disaster for the group. And for a long time, the logic of this tragedy seemed totally inescapable. People thought there were only two ways out. Either you privatize the resource completely, or the government has to step in and control everything. It was basically privatization or ruin. But what if that was a false choice all along?
Well, that is exactly what a Nobel Prize winner named Elinor Ostrom found. She did something brilliant. Instead of just theorizing, she went out and studied real communities around the world that had been successfully managing shared resources, like forests or fisheries, for hundreds of years. And what she found was amazing. They didn't need total privatization. They didn't need a heavy-handed government. Instead, these communities built their own systems from the ground up. They had things like clear boundaries, rules that made sense for their local situation, and ways to monitor each other and hold rule breakers accountable. Ostrom basically proved that the tragedy wasn't inevitable. It was just a failure of people to govern themselves effectively.
So let's switch gears a bit. Even with all these strong legal protections, it's really important to remember that private property is never, ever absolute. You know the old saying, a man's home is his castle? Well, what we sometimes forget is that every castle still sits inside a kingdom, and it has to follow the kingdom's rules. In the US, the biggest limit on your property rights is something called eminent domain. It's right there in the Fifth Amendment. It gives the government the power to take private property, but, and this is a big but, it can only do so under two very important conditions. First, it has to be for public use. And second, they have to pay you a fair price for it, what the law calls just compensation. But here's where all the controversy comes in. It's all about that little phrase, public use. What does that actually mean? And as you can see on this timeline, that definition has been stretched a lot over the years. It started out pretty straightforward, taking land for a road or a bridge. But then, in the mid-1900s, it started being used to clear entire neighborhoods that were labeled as blighted for urban renewal projects. The real bombshell, though, dropped in 2005 with a huge Supreme Court case called Kelo. In that case, the court said that a city could take someone's private home and give it to a private developer just on the hope that it would create more jobs and tax revenue. And they said that still counted as public use. Whoa. The public reaction to that Kelo decision was intense. It was swift, and it was massive. And this number right here tells the story. 47. That's the number of states that almost immediately passed new laws to fight back and to specifically restrict their governments from using eminent domain just for private economic development. It was a huge public pushback. And all of that history brings us right here to today, where brand new technologies are pushing our whole idea of ownership into places that someone like John Locke could never, ever have dreamed of. Just look at the boom in so-called virtual real estate. You might feel like you own that piece of land in the metaverse you bought, but what did you actually buy? This chart here lays out the shocking difference. With your real house, you're protected by centuries of property law. Your metaverse land, it's governed by a company's terms of service that they can change at any time. You don't have a legal title. You have an NFT, which is really just a kind of digital receipt. And maybe the biggest difference of all, the ultimate control isn't with you, it's with the company that runs the platform. And believe me, the questions get even weirder. Like, can you own parts of your own body, your own cells? In a huge court case, the answer was no. The court ruled that once your cells are removed from your body, you lose your property rights to them, even if a company later uses them to create a patent worth billions. And it's not just inner space. Look at outer space. The Outer Space Treaty from 1967 says that space is a global commons. No country can plant a flag and claim the moon. But clever new laws have created this incredible loophole. You can't own the asteroid itself, but you can claim ownership of any valuable stuff you manage to pull out of it. So here we are. From our deepest, most primal instincts, all the way to the farthest reaches of the solar system, we're still grappling with the same simple, profound question. What does it really mean to say, this is mine? It's an idea that is constantly changing, constantly being challenged, and it's still one of the most powerful forces shaping our rights, our world, and whatever comes next.